So we are so excited about this book that has just come out at Academic Studies Press. Ruskaya Kuchnya v Znanyi, or Russian Cuisine in Exile, is a book that I have loved for many years, and I'm not the only one. Came out in 1987 in the United States after a series of columns in one of the emigre newspapers. Alexander Genis and Pyotr Vail, who came to the United States in 1977, were working as journalists in New York, and they sent these columns to the Los Angeles newspaper Panorama, in which they were kind of talking about cuisine, talking about food, but also life as an exile, life as a Russian emigre, or a Soviet emigre, I suppose, in those days, in the United States, and what that life was like. And they were poking fun to some extent at the complications of life. What do you do with your culture when you're in a new place, exiled from everything that you've always known, but with a community around you? So I came to know this book actually almost immediately after it came out, when I was still in graduate school, and have loved it for years, and have quoted from it, and have used it to cook from sometimes. And then I started teaching with it. And luckily for me, Tom was in my class. One of the times that we were trying, some students and I were trying to translate a couple of the different essays, so that I got some experience with translation and discovered just how hard it is, especially with humor from the 70s and 80s. Russian humor is very difficult to translate into English, and Tom was fantastic at it. And I said, hey, what if we did this as a book? What if we actually just worked together in a way like Vail and Genis? So Vail and Genis famously wrote as a team, and they never told anyone who wrote which part. They kind of acted as if it was one voice. And I said, well, we are two different people with two utterly different approaches to language, to humor, to culture. So perhaps we can find our voices while we're translating this book.
And we won't tell anybody who wrote which part either.
We actually don't remember.
Exactly.
So one of the things that's really fun about the book and the design is that the way that it came out, we wrote all of these commentaries, and the press published them in red, which I think is really great, red on the side. So on the one hand, it's kind of decorative. On the other hand, if you really don't want to know what we have to say, you could just skip it. It doesn't really distract you. It looks like a design element. But if you're curious, you can go and look. And I've been reading those footnotes, and I've been thinking, wait, did I write that one? Wait, did you write that one? So maybe Vail and Genis would still have remembered which lines they wrote and which essays they wrote. But we've merged to some extent.
It seems to have dropped away.
Yeah.
Faded into the mist of history.
Exactly. So what did you like about working on the project?
The translation of humor is just such a fantastic and fantastically difficult thing to do. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there are so many great humorists that work in tandem either. Because it was really important. It was really important to our process for me to be able to bounce the joke off of you, to see if it lands, or if it's just got just the right amount of, groan-worthy corniness that the original Russian brought out too. Right.
Sometimes we were. I'm famously humorless, but or at least that's what my family tells me. But the kind of the bitter and the poking and the cultural references. I mean, one of the things that's tricky, I think, for Americans reading this book is that Russian culture is highly intertextual and steeped in quotations all the time. So we had to tease out not just the aphorisms and not just the jokes, but also the kind of pointed poking at emigre life. Like there's one over and over we had to talk about the starцы Kremlya, Kremlyovsky starцы, the
old men of the Kremlin,
the elders of the Kremlin. How do you explain that? How does that translate for a 21st century American audience? So there were certain things with about emigre life and emigre newspapers that Vail and Genis, that was their bread and butter, or everything. Obviously, Pushkin is everywhere.
Yes.
All kinds of other poetic references, literary references,
and misreferences.
Deliberate misreferences, misquotations.
Misattributions, especially to Pushkin, again.
And the other thing that was sort of interesting is, even things like American culture. So there's a lot of Hemingway in the Soviet culture where Vail and Genis were growing up. They were really into Hemingway, and there are a number of references to Hemingway in the book, and then we had to think about what to do with them. So the chapter that's titled "Праздник, который всегда с тобой," is a translation of the Russian version of A Movable Feast. And so we had to, not only did we have to title it A Movable Feast to make sure to reference the Hemingway, but then we also had to have a footnote saying, actually, The Movable Feast is not the name of it in Russian, and the name of it in Russian is actually kind of funny in its own way.
Yeah. A feast that you bring with you, or a holiday almost.
A holiday that is always with you, which seems like a pretty great thing, which I suppose A Movable Feast is also a great thing, especially if you like to cook and eat, which we also like to do. Although we didn't do much of it while we were working.
No.
Unfortunately.
No, that was part of the process that was maybe surprising, I think, was that Angela actually taught me a lot about technology, which you might expect to be the other way around with the change of generations. But using digital media to go back and forth with this was really central to our process.
And it was fun to sort of tease each other, and to I'm really interested in it being readable, and maybe because I'm older, I'm less literal. I certainly was very literal when I was Tom's age or a little bit younger, and he would say, "No, you can't do that. That doesn't reflect." So having those correctives for each other, where he would try to do something and I'd say, "Oh, that's not quite right," or I would try to do something and say, "No, you don't dare do that." And it was fun. And we hope that the readers will actually enjoy it as well. I think they will.
Yeah. It was fun to write. I think it's fun to read too.
Yeah, it is fun. And one of the things we were just talking about is the beginnings and the endings are really great to all the essays. And you can just kind of page through. And I feel like, especially with this format, the emigres that I know who still have this book from the 1987 original edition, the spine is broken. It's a regular paperback, and the spine is broken at the spots where their favorite soup is, or whatever recipe it is they use the most, or the pages are starting to come out, as all of our books do from the 80s. But this one, I think, is going to be great. I've already tried it at home, that you can kind of lay it out on your counter, and you can look at it, and then the recipe kind of pops out if you're going to use it, because it's got the special formatting. It's really very beautiful. And then the illustrations are just so fun. So one of the things, actually, that we did that I think was a brilliant choice was to use illustrations from the famous Soviet cookbook, the Book of Tasty and Healthy Food, that came out originally in 1939, and that was on a lot of people's shelves at home. But it gives that flavor, that kind of Soviet flavor, which is really, really important. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but this book, although it's written by emigres in emigration, is to a great extent about Soviet life. And so it's fun to have sort of these kitchen scenes from that book of Tasty and Healthy Food, and all the other illustrations that we use.
And it gives a little whiff of nostalgia to it as well, which definitely comes through in the writing as well.
Yeah, it's that really complicated nostalgia. So again, I kind of hope that some of the readers of the book will really think about and use this, juxtapose this with some of the other theory on Soviet and post-Soviet nostalgia that's out there. So it'll be fun to read, and I'm actually going to use it in class next semester.
All right.
So we'll see whether my students like it and whether we figure out a good way to interact with it.
Certainly, one of the things that I noticed in translating this and sort of trying to hunt down references that first stood out to me as references to Russian literature or what have you, is that looking through the Russian internet, this is brought up constantly. There's no shortage of references to this particular work among Russians even today. So it's still very relevant to the Russian people, and it's just to bring something like that to an English-speaking audience that might not have the 6 years to give to Russian language study in order to read it in the original. I think is huge for a cultural understanding.
And it's it is really popular in Russia and in Russian. And at one point, so we have a great interview in the back with Alexander Genis, and he said we asked him in the interview something like, how do you feel about this book now? And he says, well, I feel probably the way Conan Doyle felt about Sherlock Holmes. You know, it's the most popular thing. It overshadows everything else I do, but it hasn't shown up in English yet. And I think that a lot of people have been excited to be able to share this. Again, one of the things about Russian culture, I think it's going to be great for emigre families, children of emigre families, but also anybody who's ever studied Russian and your mother doesn't understand, and your grandmother doesn't understand, and your cousin can't figure out what you see in Russian culture. And now all of a sudden you can say, look at these illustrations, and look at these jokes, and look at these references, and you can see the multi-layers of Russian culture, and show it to your friends and family. So all of my neighbors are already lining up to get copies, which I'm pretty excited about. My sister bought a copy right away, so that saves me from having to return for the holidays.
I thought the false hair was maybe not the most appetizing, but certainly the most certainly interesting. Just for the way that they talk about it.
We're never going to find it.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the stuff we're never going to eat. Also, the big problem is I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat sala, and I'm never going to eat sala. Here's a chapter 23, salat is and sala, right? Salad and sala. But the non-false non-hare, chapter 38.
But the way that they talk about it, it's not just as a food item, right? It's they discuss it in terms of a visual appreciation for the food item as well, because it cuts. It's a sort of a meatloaf, roughly speaking, to translate the idea, that is filled with various other food items, hard-boiled eggs, pickles, and so forth. And they talk about when you slice into it and you get the cross-sections of the various foods, and sort of visual appeal of that, in addition to the sort of practical nutritional aspects.
This is they say, in this universal dish that you've prepared, there is no hair, but there's nothing false either. Just one more step on the path to truth. And they start out the essay by talking about Solzhenitsyn. So again, this today, more or less, which is the 100th anniversary of Solzhenitsyn's birth, it's interesting to see him evoked in a couple of different places because, of course, for emigres in the 70s and especially in the 80s, he was a huge presence in America, and it was important to kind of position yourself vis-a-vis Solzhenitsyn. So in terms of my favorite recipes, I mean, I still need to get a clay pot. I really love the idea of, sort of slow cooking in a clay pot, and I do some of that in a kind of a metal version of that. I have made, actually this year for the first time, I made the Charlotka recipe, which is, I think if you have enough apples and enough sugar, everything tastes good, and enough butter.